Welcome to Wesley Impact once again. We've been looking at the life of the Wesleys, and today it's Charles Wesley's turn. Because here we are at Charles Wesley's house in Bristol, where for 22 years he lived, not far from the family church. Let's take a look inside at the home of this great hymn writer who wrote over 6,000 hymns, some of the most wonderful in the story of the church.
Charles Wesley was the youngest son of Susanna and Samuel Wesley, born in Epworth in Lincolnshire on the 18th of December 1707. Although quite different in temperament, Charles and his brother John pursued similar academic and religious interests. Both entered the same college, Christ Church. Both sailed to Georgia for missionary service. Whilst both had doubts about their faith, they were encouraged by conversations with the Moravians in London, which led to their own special experience of conversion 3 days apart from each other. Like John, Charles' preaching style was transformed. His preaching at its best was thunder and lightning, as one of the early Methodists put it. He entered itinerant ministry in 1739, married in 1749, and was often accompanied on his journeys by his wife Sarah Gwynne. They had 8 children, 3 of which survived. Charles Jr. and Samuel later went on to become talented musicians and recognised as composers in their own right.
Philip Carter, it's good to talk to you. Methodist music, and Charles Wesley in particular, has been a passion of yours, hasn't it?
That's correct, yes.
Charles Wesley, we're in his house now, where he lived for 22 years, and probably in this very room, his wife certainly would have played music and taught the boys here. What do you think, really, Charles Wesley, if you were summing up Charles Wesley's contribution to the Methodist movement and to the world story of music, what do you think it would be?
Well, of course, we're told that Charles Wesley was, in fact, the first Methodist. He was involved, or partially formed, the Holy Club in Oxford in the period when John had left Oxford and was helping father out in Epworth. And Charles and a group of friends, George Whitefield, as the Americans say, George Whitefield, founded the Holy Club, in which were given the derogatory title Methodists. So some would say he was number one. Whether he or John would agree is another question.
They had a kind of rigorous relationship, didn't they? That really was quite challenging of one another. But I think history will probably show them to have been complementary of one another.
Yes, not only were they complementary, I think each was the lesser without the other.
Now, would you say that, I'm thinking now of the Methodist revival and those times of the evangelical revival of the 18th century. Charles, in a way, gave voice, really, to the movement in a way that was different than sermons, didn't he?
Yes. It has often been said by British Methodist dignitaries in public that if in the hereafter they had the choice of John Wesley's sermons or Charles Wesley's hymns, there would be no conflict.
And if you were to choose one hymn of Charles Wesley that describes the spirit of Charles Wesley, what hymn would that be?
Like many enthusiastic Methodists, my choice has varied over the years, but recently, especially with the recent royal wedding, I have to put Love Divine or Love's Excelling as number one.
Now, why would that be?
Because I think it encapsulates the nature of God and our hope for eternity. There's nothing quite like it, and it is so flexible that it can appear at a wedding, it can appear at a funeral, it can appear a time of fellowship and rejoicing, it can appear everywhere. The late Cardinal Archbishop of Westminster had it at his funeral, and it was at the recent royal wedding. That somehow encapsulates.
Charles Wesley's hymns, what do you think they've given to the world church? Not just within Methodism, but within the whole Christian family?
I think they've given some iconic firsts Oh, for a thousand tongues to sing, based on that Moravian's comment, if I had 1,000 tongues, I would praise him with them all. And can it be not the most suitable tune, but you'll never separate that tune from it, which sums up the sheer stupendous joy of suddenly realizing that it was for me. It was for me. Yet in other ways, I dare to suggest, and this is my own suggestion, that when the Almighty was handing out talents, he gave the Methodist Church Charles Wesley's hymns, and we don't treasure them as we should do. At the same time, I'm a great enthusiast for contemporary hymnody. So if I had my choice, it would be a very big new hymn book.
How dangerous is it for us to forget our history?
I think it's very dangerous because today is built on yesterday, and our history is what creates the pattern which we either follow or reject. The profoundness of Charles Wesley's hymnody. One of our leading experts in hymnody is the late professor of English at Durham University, who in personal correspondence to me, talking about this place, said, I think Charles Wesley's hymns are as important to Bristol, or should be, as Shakespeare's plays are to Stratford-on-Avon. And of the two, I would say Charles Wesley's hymns were the more important.
That's, of course, a little biased, but I tend to think it's a pretty good bias. Let me try to picture, if I can, the city of Bristol while Charles was living here, because it would be a very different kind of Bristol, wasn't it?
Oh yes, no motorised transport of any sort, either travelling by coach or on horseback or with a pony and trap. That you were saying about Charles coming into the house with his thoughts of music. There is a story that he used to appear at the front door and jump off his horse and say, paper, pencil, paper, pencil. He got a new idea.
Well, if you're going to write 6,000 hymns, you're going to be...
S.T. Kimbrough, the founder, president of the Charles Wesley Society, who worked for the General Board of Global Ministries in Washington, says it's in excess of 9,000 hymns and religious poems. So it's a tremendous number, and if you think he probably started in 1738 at the heart warming that they both went through, and he died in 1788, well, in those 50 years, that's a lot of writing hymns, isn't it?
It's prolific, and I think of all the events that surround that May of 1738, the 21st of May, when Charles came into a real experience of Jesus Christ, was really such a wonderful thing. And when John went back that night, they sang a hymn, didn't they?
Yes. When John went back and said, guess what's happened to me today? And Charles said, it happened to me 3 days ago. You know, that's where Charles was always in front a little bit.
And what was it that they sang?
Well, we've always thought it was Where Shall My Wandering Soul Begin? And for many years here at the New Room, we would always sing it tonight. But there are those who think it's more likely to have been And Can It Be? And it will be And Can It Be tonight.
But the reality is that whatever it is, it was something exciting. And Philip, thank you very much for giving us your time today.
It's a great privilege. Thank you.
It's also been said that Charles celebrated almost every event in life with a hymn. A selection of his work was first published in 1739. One person wrote, "If there be such a thing as heavenly music upon earth, I heard it there." Charles, who was never in the best of health, desired to spend more time with his family and gave up itinerant preaching in 1756.
So John and Charles' ministry complemented one another. John was preaching in the open air, and here in this house, Charles was designing the hymns that would make such a difference to the evangelical revival. And in a moment I want to take you to Hannam Mount, which was the first place that John preached in the open air.
The Methodist style was to take the word of God to people wherever they were, rather than try to get them to come to church to hear it. The numbers of converts grew and were gathered into societies to nurture their faith.
John Goddard, it's good to talk to you here at Hannam Mount. It's a windy day today, but this is an important place in the story of the world church. Why do you think this is important?
Well, this is where John Wesley preached to 3,000 miners from the Kingswood area. He didn't want to do it himself. He was persuaded by George Whitfield to take to open-air preaching.
And really you can imagine that John, who'd been used to conducting worship in the confines, the four walls of a church, this would be an enormous step, wouldn't it?
Oh yes, because, you know, outdoors, squeaky voice, he was only 5'3", and he spoke in very high English, and the miners around this area spoke with a very, very bad language, you know.
But for John, this was another kind of conversion. He found his way to Christ, but there was another sense in which he was converted to taking the gospel then to the world. And you find people come here from other parts of the world today?
We find people from here from all over the world. Most recently, we get coachloads of Koreans.
So what we're doing is looking out really over the city here, and we're looking south really of Bristol at the moment, and it would be in this direction that John would preach in those days, and miners would come from the Kingswood area who would probably be alienated from the normal church life.
Oh, they would never have seen a church. They were drunken. They were very, very different people. They had no idea of a church.
And for John, he became convinced that this was a place that he ought to preach. Try to explain to me where John would come from. Which direction would he come from?
Well, he would come south across the river on his horse and ride up here. Of course, it was all open fields in those days. The miners would come when they knew that he was here.
Thank you, John, for talking to us and giving us an insight into what is a very important World Methodist heritage site, and reminding us of the importance of field preaching in the story.
Well, thank you for inviting me. Thank you.
While churches closed their doors to them, those inspired by their work advanced funds to purchase headquarters in London, in Bristol and in Newcastle in the northeast. While Charles Wesley was initially opposed to the building of the new room, he went on to lead the Methodist societies in Bristol. I met with the Reverend Ward Jones to tell us more about the work of the Wesleys and how their influence carries on today.
What place is Bristol in the story of John Wesley?
Oh, in the southwest certainly, it's the hub of everything that went on in those early days. This was where they came together, where the preachers stayed together. They then travelled out over the whole of the southwest and into Wales.
And so this first chapel of Methodism, a preaching house, wasn't just a place where people came to services and hear the word of God. It was much more than that, wasn't it?
Well, kids came here to be educated, had a school here. He provided health care. They dispensed medicines to the poor.
Your responsibility today in the Bristol district stretches far beyond the city of Bristol. So what are the challenges today?
The challenges today are actually for the church to become relevant again to the world in which we live. I mean, it's amazing. People are much more open now in this country to spiritual matters, but they don't look to the church. They think we're out of it these days. And so we've really got to sort of look out again.
So what can we learn from John Wesley?
What can we learn from John Wesley? He took an interest in people. Healthcare, education, prison visiting, social needs. John Wesley was concerned about what was going on in the big wide world and went out into the world, and that for me is what we've got to do and what we're trying to do here and in the churches across the district now.
Now I know it's in a different era, but how would they receive his message today?
Well, I think people would be stimulated by this guy who came along and was creating an impression. One presumes, he'd be creating an impression, so he'd arrive here and the people of Bristol, an inquisitive people, what's going on? And I think he'd make an impact.
And of course, this city is built on many of those things that John spoke against, really. We think of this city having its great tobacco industry, its liquor, its slavery, and all those things. And John's message was sometimes received with a great deal of negativity also.
But he challenged people. I mean, he celebrated in the city council buildings. There are plaques on the wall about great people in Bristol, and he's one of those people. And the city council value his contribution to the locality.
Well, that's wonderful to talk to you.
Bless you, it's great to have you here.
It's been 200 years since the first Methodists met in Australia. To celebrate 2 centuries of faith and pioneering care, CEO and presenter Reverend Dr. Keith Garner takes us back to where it all began.
But we don't begin here at the heart of London. We begin in a town in the north of England.
In this fascinating narrative, Reverend Garner chronicles the history of the life and times of the founder of Methodism, John Wesley. This fresh and thought-provoking documentary takes us on a journey throughout the United Kingdom, beginning in John Wesley's hometown of Epworth.
John Wesley was born here on the 17th of June, 1703.
This 1-hour DVD travels onto his education years and beginnings of social justice in Oxford, to his final years in London. For more information on John Wesley, the man and his mission, call 02 9263 5555 or email us at impacttv@wesleymission.org.au.
As we continue to think about John Wesley and his preaching and the kind of things he had to say, we remember very often the context of those messages. Sometimes they were preached sermons, often they were written sermons. And in a particular written sermon to the Arminian magazine in 1782, John strikes a note that perhaps enters into something of the controversy of the day. It helps us to understand some of the debates that were going on about the gospel. He took as his text Romans 5 verse 15. Not as the transgression, so is the free gift. Now there were some people who thought the gospel was restricted. They thought somehow the gospel were offered to a select number of people, not just those in church, but those who were specially called. And there were those that were called and those who weren't called. But John had a real passion to reach out with the gospel for all the world. Of course, it's expressed in terms of miners and fishermen and lead miners, people who knew what it was to know the need of Jesus Christ. But when John talked about God's love for fallen humanity, he was talking about that condition, that basis of people's lives by which their need became so obvious. He didn't want to say that the fall was a good thing, but he did want to say, because of the fall, we have discovered things about God and about Jesus Christ that we would have never ever known in any other way. He wrote that without the fall, Christ would not have died. Of course, because the fall happened, Jesus Christ came into the world to save sinners, as the Apostle Paul put it. Without Christ, there would have been no such thing as the gift of faith and faith in God. And without Christ, there would have been no intimate relationship with God. All these things are possible and made real because of the fall of humanity. Because the human race fell, God entered into our humanity and raises us with Jesus Christ. And because of the fall, we can see how much God brings out of evil and how much holiness and happiness can come and meet us at our point of need. And so it was to miners, and so it was to people in need, that he reached out and he saw this gospel as all-embracing and not something in any way restricted. When he reflected upon Galatians and what we know as the fruit of the Spirit, he says these things too would not be known to us: patience, meekness, gentleness, long-suffering, so many of the graces described in Galatians 5, 22 and 23. And the fall makes all these things possible. The truth is that this debate was a powerful debate, but it was a debate that every evangelist wanted to be a part of. If you really were an evangelist reaching out to all the world, you had to be sure that that message really was for all the world and not for those especially selected apart from others. John Wesley himself wrote these words: "Man abusing liberty produced evil and brought sin and pain into this world. This God permitted in order to a fuller manifestation of his wisdom, justice and mercy. It's a wonderful truth really that Wesley not only believed but practiced all his life. From a young man who found that experience of heartwarming to a mission to all the world, he was driven by a real sense that people mattered and that nobody needed to be excluded. We at Wesley Mission believe the same things. We too are caught up in that wonderful tradition. We recognise and we see on all fronts the fact that the human race is fallen. We see so many signs of it, and yet we do believe that somehow we must reach out in care, compassion and hope and offer something better to people so that they too can be raised with God in Jesus Christ. Thankfully, we know it still works. It's still real. But here in Bristol, where John first discovered that message, a message that he discovered by offering to miners, we too embrace. When he preached to 3,000 miners at this place, he saw their response. It surprised him, for they had black, coal dust faces, and tears soon ran down their eyes as they heard him offer Jesus Christ. And that message which he believed in was now not locked in church and would be forever a message to the world, a message spoken through the lips of human beings to the heart of people in need.
To commemorate 200 years of faith and pioneering care in Australia, Wesley Mission has released a publication documenting its work in the community.
Everyone needs a little rest, everyone needs a little joy.
For more information on today's people, today's story, you can contact us on 02 9263 5555 or email us at impacttv@wesleymission.org.au.
I hope you've really enjoyed being with us in this programme where we've looked at Charles Wesley. Well, next week we're off to London, and when we're in London we'll discover something of how the Wesley brothers saw the Christian faith applied to the social world, and we'll be looking at the world of politics and Christianity. I look forward to seeing you at the same time next week. Goodbye and God bless you.
Love divine, oh love's excelling joy of heaven to earth come down, fix in us thy heart.